Today is September 29th, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues. We are seeing increasing numbers of reports across the Western media about the depletion of Western military power as they continue trying to support Ukrainian forces along the line of contact, behind the line of contact, the training of additional Ukrainian forces. In all of these areas, the collective West is admitting they are unable to continue supplying Ukraine sufficiently, and because of that, Ukrainian combat power is in decline. Now, I'm going to go through some of these articles. I'm going to go over the latest weapons packages that the U.S. Department of Defense has announced. But before that, let's look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map, so keep that in mind. Look at where this pro-Ukrainian map says Russian troops are, and look at how some of these Western articles try to spin reality, even when pro-Ukrainian sources are admitting otherwise. If we zoom in, again, if you're completely new to all of this, red is under Russian control. The line of contact stretches from Kherson in the south across Zaporozhye, the Donbass region. There is a Russian presence in Kharkov all the way here in the east, as well as in the north. And here is the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, which had been larger than this, has already been pushed back by Russian counter-offensives. This continues to be a spot of interest to watch, but most of the focus over the last week since my last update has been, again, in the direction toward Pokrovsk. Russian forces continuing to push toward Pokrovsk. We can see this pro-Ukrainian map admitting Russian forces taking additional territory. And this was despite last week Ukrainian sources trying to claim that they had stopped the Russian advance. We see these red rifle icons. This means that there's fighting in this area, not necessarily that Russia has claimed and consolidated control over that territory, but definitely that Russian forces are operating in that area. And if we come down here, Vugledar, which is a heavily fortified urban area, you can see is not that large, but there are a lot of large, very sturdy concrete buildings that Ukraine heavily fortified the approaches to Vugledar, and had been keeping Russian forces at bay for many months, a year or more. And now, as you can see, even this pro-Ukrainian map admits Russian forces are now moving into the urban area, the built-up urban area. You can see Russian forces all along the perimeter of this urban area, and we can see further up north, Russian forces have pushed west, and a encirclement is taking shape here, even according to this pro-Ukrainian map. Now, I don't show pro-Russian maps because I'm not trying to convince people that follow Russian media, Russian reports, or Russian claims, but a lot of those maps are showing a much more complete encirclement of Vugledar. Now, what is the Western media saying about Vugledar before we get into the arms and ammunition problems? We have this article from Reuters. Russian forces storming East Ukrainian town of Vugledar, bloggers and media say. And this is just a way of trying to minimize the impact of this news. Even in this article, it admits there are Ukrainian sources reporting this, not just Russian bloggers and media. And we just saw the pro-Ukrainian live map also admit this. So let's see what the Reuters article has to say. Russian forces have begun storming the eastern Ukrainian town of Vugledar, a stronghold that had resisted Russian attacks since the beginning of the 2022 war, according to Russian war bloggers and state media. And by that, they mean Russian state media. Russian forces in eastern Ukraine advanced at their fastest rate in 2 years in August, according to multiple open source maps, even though a Ukrainian incursion into Russia's Kursk region sought to force Moscow to divert troops. Well, that didn't happen. That never worked out for Ukraine. Ukraine's military made no reference to Russian gains around Vugledar, but acknowledged there was fighting in the area. And again, look at the live map and see how Russian forces are indicated being in the urban built-up area. Then Reuters admits they're citing the head of the Ukrainian Security Council's Center for Countering Disinformation. They said Russia's use of guided aerial bombs had helped it advance in the area. Vugledar used to be easy to defend. It is on high ground. But with the active arrival of guided aerial bombs at the front, the enemy managed to destroy it and move to the flank. So this is a Ukrainian source admitting that Russian forces are right up on Vugledar. Guided aerial bombs and aviation are the only things that allow the enemy infantry to move. Ukraine's deep state open source intelligence analyst said on Telegram that Russian troops were trying to encircle Vugledar and had been pummeling it with artillery and guided bombs. And who at this point thinks that it isn't just a matter of time before Vugledar is inevitably encircled and taken by Russian forces, considering Ukraine's inability all along the line of contact to stop the advance of Russian forces. This is how the Reuters article concludes, by the way. It says, the relatively swift westward advance of Russia's forces, which have a numerical advantage, has involved encircling towns and forcing often exhausted Ukrainian troops to withdraw. I think that a gradual withdrawal from these positions there is inevitable given the developing trends. And this is a Kiev-based military analyst saying this. So even Ukrainian sources realize it is inevitable that Vugledar will eventually be taken by Russian forces. Ukrainian forces are going to continue falling back west. This is not news to anyone who's been following my updates over the last 2+ years, but for people who have been following the Western media, this will all come as a shock. Now let's talk about the arms and the ammunition, and this is the reason why Ukrainian forces are unable to stop the advance of Russian forces. If Russian military capabilities continue to grow, the West is incapable of supplying Ukrainian forces with sufficient arms and ammunition. Their forces will be depleted, and it will become increasingly difficult to reconstitute those forces. It is a war of attrition, is working decisively in Russia's favor, and this is just an objective reality that even Western reports. And the announcements of these arms packages simply reinforce. So let's look at this other Reuters article. This is U.S. prepares $8 billion in arms aid packages for Zelensky visit, sources say, dated September 25th, 2024. The article says the U.S. plans to announce more than $8 billion worth of military assistance for Ukraine during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Washington. Two U.S. officials said the White House intends to notify Congress. It'll move forward with the announcement of a $5.6 billion drawdown from U.S. weapons stockpiles, which are heavily depleted. The contents of that package is still in flux, and I just want to remind people of this CNN article from September 17th, 2024. U.S. military aid packages to Ukraine shrink amid concerns over Pentagon stockpiles. The stockpiles are depleted, and America's military-industrial base is incapable of replenishing them fast enough. The Reuters article goes on and says the second announcement slated for September 26 will be for a $2.4 billion worth of aid under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative Program, which allows the administration to buy weapons for Ukraine from companies rather than pull them from U.S. stockpiles. And by buy them from companies, it means signing contracts and having the equipment manufactured, or at best drawn from monthly production. In addition, the U.S. announced on September 25th $375 million worth of presidential drawdown authority for Ukraine. The package will include the first shipment of precision-guided glide bombs with a range of up to 81 miles or 130 kilometers, called the Joint Standoff Weapon. Two U.S. officials said the inclusion of that weapon was not disclosed in the announcement. If we look at the announcement, which is right here, September 25th, 2024, they talk about air-to-ground munitions. So that would cover something like a glide bomb. Now, there are two major problems with this longer-range glide bomb. The U.S. has already provided glide bombs to Ukraine, the JDAM. And the problem with the JDAM is, number one, Ukraine does not have enough military aviation to deliver large numbers of these to make any relevant difference on the battlefield. The second problem is, even when they do deliver these weapons to places along the line of contact or close to it, their GPS signal is jammed and they miss their target. This is a huge problem. This is something that the Western media, Western experts have been talking about for quite some time. This was from last year, June 2023. Jamming JDAM, the threat to US munitions from Russian electronic warfare. The link to this will be in the video description below. It's all about how Russia is jamming GPS signals and preventing US precision-guided weapons that require a GPS signal, prevents them from hitting their targets with any amount of accuracy. The GPS-guided 155 millimeter artillery round, the Excaliburs, has almost fallen out of use because it is not worth the trouble of using it versus the probability it will be jammed and miss its target. Now, will some of these bombs get through and hit targets and be featured in videos by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense? Of course. And that is mainly what this is all about. It's about creating the illusion that Ukraine is still in the fight, still able to fight, when in reality, strategically, these bombs are going to make no difference. As a matter of fact, using your military aviation with a limited number of precision-guided weapons that require you to get relatively close to being possibly shot down by Russian air-to-air capabilities and air defense capabilities, I don't think that it's actually worth the risk, considering how limited Ukraine's military aviation actually is. But let's go through these arms packages as I always do. I want to go through the drawdown first, this one. Both of these were mentioned in the Reuters article. This is $375 million drawdown. All of this equipment exists in stockpiles, either drawn from monthly production rates or just sitting around, not being used and available to spare for Ukraine. The other package that I will go over is this one. This is the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. Again, all of this is going to be contracts. It could take weeks, months, years for any of those items to reach Ukraine. So let's go over what is being drawn from existing stockpiles. Air-to-ground munitions, that's almost certainly the joint standoff weapon. I just explained all the problems that a GPS-guided glide bomb has. They also say ammunition for the high-mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS. Now, at the rate Ukraine is using these guided rockets, which is several per day, they will not run out of rockets. But the problem is, when you're only firing a small handful of these guided rockets, even though they are at times effective, but again, they face GPS jamming as well. You're not firing nearly enough of them to make any sort of difference, not anywhere close to the number of precision-guided multiple launch rockets that Russia is firing back at Ukrainian positions, the Tornado S being Russia's equivalent of the HIMARS. 155 and 105 millimeter artillery ammunition. I've exhaustively talked about how there isn't enough artillery ammunition across the West to send Ukraine, and there never will be. They're not even talking about any program, any series of steps to match Russia's current production rate of artillery shells, let alone somehow exceed it. They're not even talking about doing it. Right now, the US has a goal of manufacturing 100,000 artillery shells per month. This will still take a year, possibly 2 to 3 more years. It requires additional funding from Congress to be approved of. By the time they reach this goal, it's still going to be less than what Russia is making just right now. But Russia continues expanding its own production. So by then, Russia will be making many times more. Then we have tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4. These are all anti-armor systems. All of these are being drawn from monthly production. The US does not make a lot of these per month. And on top of all of that, they have about a 19% hit rate. And that's when used by properly trained US troops, not hastily trained conscripts in the Ukrainian military. And what this means is that even if every missile made by the US month to month was sent to Ukraine. They're not sending enough missiles to destroy Russia's armor faster than Russia makes it month to month. We also have the M1117 armored security vehicle. These are armored vehicles. They exist somewhere between up-armored Humvees and the MRAP, which is a mine-resistant vehicle, more heavily armed. The up-armored Humvee, less heavily armed. This four-wheeled vehicle. And this is just because the US has a lot of these laying around, and Ukraine needs combat vehicles of any kind. This is not a war-winning capability by any stretch of the imagination. Also on the list is mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs. They also say light tactical vehicles, so this is probably Humvees, pickup trucks, SUVs. Armored bridging systems, small arms, patrol boats, demolition equipment and munitions, spare parts, ancillary equipment, services, training, and transportation. All things that every army needs and has, that Russia has in abundance. But none of these capabilities are going to win Ukraine the war. As a matter of fact, almost certainly these items are not reaching Ukraine in the quantities required just to sustain the war. So we had that, and then we have the contracts, all of these munitions and support for Ukrainian air defense systems. I've talked about how the US has depleted its air defense systems. They don't make enough air defense missiles. They never will. They're not even talking about doing it. They will never be able to provide enough air defense to Ukraine to protect its skies from Russian missile strikes. They talk about air-to-ground munitions, drones, counter-drone equipment, communication equipment, and equipment and material to support Ukrainian munitions production, spare parts, maintenance, and sustainment support. So this bit about supporting Ukraine munition production. Anywhere munition production is taking place on any significant scale, Russia will find it and they will destroy it as an exercise in futility. But it is the type of step that you would take when you're trying to divest from Ukraine. You tell the world you're giving them the ability to fight for themselves, to manufacture their own arms themselves, so you can wash your hands of it. This is a very similar process the US went through regarding South Vietnam, which no longer exists. It was washed away by Northern Vietnam, and then North and South Vietnam became Vietnam. So when I go over these arms packages, I talk about how US stockpiles are depleted. Their military-industrial base is insufficient to replenish their stockpiles. I shared articles like this from CNN admitting to all of that. And now we have this article from Times. This is UK media. UK weapons stockpiles threadbare after arming Ukraine. So it's not just the US. It's not actually just the UK, because this article says Western allies have almost nothing left in their stockpiles to hand over to Ukraine. After more than 2 years, 2.5 years of fighting, the Armed Forces Minister has said, so this is the UK Armed Forces Minister talking about this. He's talking about the UK. He's also talking about Europe and the United States. And this is obvious to all. Before crucial talks on the war at the United Nations headquarters in New York, Luke Pollard said the focus needed to be on ramping up weapons production between the West and Ukraine as part of a longer-term strategy that would keep a reliable supply of equipment heading to the country. Now, this is a fantasy. This is impossible for the collective West to do. I've talked about this at length. Why? And it has to do with the fact that to expand production, you have to expand existing facilities, build new facilities, expand your pool of trained manpower, which requires reforming education, expanding your education system, expanding training programs. All of this will take years and years to actually do. Russia was doing this years before they launched the special military operation. The collective West will take years to match. We often hear the Western media cite U.S. artillery shell production as an example of how easy it is for the collective West, when they want to expand production of arms and ammunition. But the fact is, the shelf facilities, the shell manufacturing facilities in the US are owned by the US Army, and they made the decision years before the special military operation began to begin expanding them, whether the production capacity was required or not. So that was something they had a head start on. That is the only reason they have made the amount of progress that they have. And they are still falling short, because they would have had to determine years ago to reach the huge quantity required now in this conflict. They only were aiming at a relatively modest expansion in production compared to what is required in Ukraine. Then the Times reports John Healey, the defense secretary, suggests that Ukraine was also running out of troops to send to the West for training. He told a fringe event at the labor conference earlier this week that the biggest constraint in training Ukrainians was Ukraine providing the personnel in order to be trained. But I would say that is a huge constraint. But the other problem is that the collective West doesn't know how to train these Ukrainians to go fight the type of war that they face in Ukraine in the first place. There's also not enough time. Russia is wiping out Ukrainian forces faster than they can be trained. You cannot train conscripts in a couple of weeks and send them to the front. They require at least a half a year of training, if not more. To be effective on the battlefield, you have to train soldiers individually, and then you have to train them in units of varying sizes, from fire teams, squads, platoons, battalions, all the way up to the brigade level, which is 4,000 men. That could take a year, 2 years, 3 years to do. They don't have time to do any of this. Then the Times says a report by the National Audit Office this month found that the British military stockpiles were so threadbare that the government was forced to slash donations to Ukraine in the middle of last year. The Ministry of Defense sharply reduced transfers of military equipment to Kiev in the middle of 2023 after concluding further donations of lethal aid would pose unacceptable risks to the UK's military readiness. So this was something that already happened last year. We see the effects of this playing out now. The Western media, Western experts, Western politicians have done their best to try to cover this up, to try to perpetuate the myth that Ukraine either has an advantage on the battlefield or is still in the fight. But as we can see, even the Western media now is increasingly admitting that this is not true. Articles like this in the Times are an admission that this is not true and that Ukraine cannot sustain the fight. So what comes next? If Ukraine is inevitably going to lose this war of attrition, what comes next? And we have seen the United States and its allies maneuvering strategically, diplomatically, to try to perhaps intervene more directly. We saw a dramatic shift in Russia's nuclear doctrine in response to this. I will defer to the Duran, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mukuris. They do in-depth videos every single day on the conflict in Ukraine. Their information will be in the video description below. Mark Soboda also does very in-depth analysis of the political, diplomatic aspects of this conflict. They have gone in depth over the change in nuclear doctrine and what it means. I suspect that the collective West was considering something exceptionally reckless, and this is what prompted Russia to change its nuclear doctrine, to get ahead of it and to warn that it will not be tolerated and it will trigger catastrophic consequences if the collective West does something drastic. Now, this always ends with me talking about the overarching geopolitical objective of the United States, which is global primacy. This is a post-Cold War geopolitical objective that they have been pursuing ever since. They want to control Europe, all of Eurasia, the Asia-Pacific region, Africa, Latin America, and they are going to crush any country or groups of nations that are going to pose as competition to their global primacy. That includes Russia, China, Iran, obviously, nations like Venezuela and Latin America that refuse to subordinate themselves to the US, but it also includes Europe. Europe will not be allowed to have an independent foreign policy or economic policy, and we see exactly how that all played out. Germany with the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, the US literally just blowing it up because Germany refused to cancel the project. The precipitation of this conflict in Ukraine to convince Europe to cut off all ties with first Russia and now incrementally with China. So this conflict in Ukraine is part of a much wider global conflict taking place right now. We see a conflict in the Middle East growing, escalating, and we see tensions in the Asia-Pacific region escalating. And this is all because the US sees its primacy being displaced, and it is desperately trying to reassert itself. Desperation equates to dangerous, especially a nation like the US with still so much military power, including nuclear weapons. So we have to keep a very close eye on this. We have to keep all of this in context. We cannot get overly absorbed in any one particular conflict. We need to repeatedly zoom out and see how it fits into the bigger picture. I will continue keeping an eye on this, the conflict in Ukraine, and how it fits into the wider geopolitical picture. In the meantime, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. YouTube is deleting entire channels over content regarding Ukraine. If my channel is deleted, you can find all of my videos on Rumble and also on Telegram. So please check that out in case I disappear off of YouTube. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you could help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, all of this is greatly appreciated. Even if you have no additional resources and you're just helping share my work with others, that is a great help. That is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.